Hey everyone, Dr. Hadisha here. Thank you so much for joining me on my podcast, Mahan Health with Dr. Hadisha. Mahan literally translates to great in Sanskrit, and it just doesn't make sense to have anything but the absolute best when it comes to your health. My goal is by you listening or watching this podcast, you're getting just a little bit closer to achieving Mahan or great health yourself. This podcast is all for you, so please make sure to comment what you'd like to learn more about so I can get a guest on the show who's an expert in that field, or I might even talk about it myself. Today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview an esteemed colleague and mentor of mine, Dr. Amy Chadwick. In this episode, we're talking about something called endobiogeny. This is probably new for a lot of you, but endobiogeny is a terrain theory that assesses how the internal life of the body is generated and sustained. It's a systems theory of biology that considers the endocrine system to be the true manager of the body. Dr. Amy Chadwick is a licensed naturopathic doctor and has been in private practice for over 13 years, serving patients of all ages and stages of life. Dr. Chadwick teaches, lectures, and writes on a diverse range of topics from plant medicine to sound healing, from energetics and holding space in the doctor-patient relationship to philosophy to integrative physiology and systems biology. She graduated from the National University of Natural Medicine in Portland, Oregon, and she interned in both women's medicine and in the treatment of chronic and neurodevelopmental disease utilizing biotherapeutic drainage. Her 8 years of practice in Alaska served families in a small community where she honed in on her diagnostic skills and learned to trust the innate power of the body to heal. Now, living and working in San Diego, Dr. Chadwick utilizes therapies rooted in ancient and modern clinical wisdom such as nutrition, lifestyle modification, and botanical medicine, as well as the short-term utilization of higher intervention therapies as needed to restore balance. She has a natural curiosity and works to understand her patients' stories and individual patterns in order to empower her patients to embrace wellness, offering tools to thrive on a daily basis. She continually pursues an in-depth knowledge of physiology, astute observation, and a willingness to keep asking why and how. Continuing to pursue systems theory medicine, Dr. Chadwick has studied the ancient systems theory of Ayurvedic medicine and has completed a fellowship in endobiogenic medicine, a systems biology model rooted in modern scientific principles of integrative physiology. Recognizing the endocrine system as the manager of physiology allows for a profound understanding of why repeated or intense stressors, emotions, and belief patterns can lead to imbalance and disease, and provides a map for effective treatment. I met Dr. Chadwick in medical school. She was one of my professors, supervisors, mentors, and I love everything that I was able to learn from her. I was able to learn so much, and I'm so excited for you all to hear from her as well. So make sure to leave comments below on what you thought of this episode and reach out to Dr. Chadwick or myself after the show. All right, enjoy. Hi, Dr. Chadwick. How are you doing today?
Hi, Dr. Hadisha. I am doing really well.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today on our show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Of course. All right. So I'm going to get right into it. With every guest, I ask this question because I really do think our stories are what define us. And so I want to know what your story is. What was your journey towards naturopathic medicine? What led you to this path?
Yeah. So, it's funny. I think that's it's the story that everybody wants to know. Like, how did you get here? Because it's not always a path that anybody even knew existed. Especially for me, being, when I got to naturopathic school, there certainly just wasn't as much knowledge about it. So, and that was true for me. I grew up, in Idaho. I definitely didn't know anything about naturopathic medicine, but I knew from the time I was about 9 years old that I really, it wasn't just that I wanted to, it was that I was going to be a doctor. And so that was a solid plan for me, and there really just wasn't any question about it. And I interned with doctors even while I was in high school. I was ready to go down that path. Started my pre-med undergrad, and this has happened a few times in my life, but got a very strong intuitive message, for lack of another word, that just said, this is not your path. Don't, like, you're not going to go to medical school the way you know it, and you won't be the person you want to be coming out of it. And I had absolutely no idea like what that meant or what direction I was going to take. And it was a little bit derailing because that was all that I had known since childhood that I wanted to do. And so the next several years were really this exploration for me of, okay, I'm listening to this voice, but I'm not getting the next answer about what it is that I'm supposed to do. And there are all kinds of stories from those years, but I worked in a number of different fields. I worked in business, and I worked helping to run a home for juvenile delinquents and kids with like oppositional defiant conduct disorder. I lived in a Native Alaska village for a couple of years. I worked in fisheries. I did all these different things and kept kind of searching, okay, where am I going to continue my education at? What am I going to do after I had finished my undergrad? And was working through some of my own health issues, was working through some fertility things. And so during that process, ended up being introduced to a naturopathic doctor. And also at the same time started doing some reading. I started reading Christiane Northrup's Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom. And, there was just this, again, there was this very strong voice as I was partway through that book. And this other naturopathic doctor was not necessarily like, it wasn't that what he did was what I wanted to do, but it just knowing that that existed also gave me that same voice back that said, this is what you've been trying to put together. Because after doing all those different jobs, I knew what I wanted most was to be able to work with a whole human. And I wanted to think about food and mental health and touch and community and, all of these parts of us that make us human and that either allow us to be healthy or not. And I was watching so much of all of that being segregated by different practitioners. And that has just always been my personality, is to integrate all these things. But I didn't know that there was a road to do that. Yeah.
Yes.
And so it was like, as soon as the light bulb clicked that there was a road to do it, then I knew. And a year later started naturopathic med school. So
I love it. I love that all of our stories have this kind of like, oh, this is it. This is this is it. We just know, it was very intuitive. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome.
So how did you get involved in endobiogeny specifically? Well, what drew you towards that? And then, you can go ahead and explain what it really is too.
Sure. So, I graduated from naturopathic med school and I went back to Alaska and I was working in small town family medicine. But for me, what continued to come up over and over were these really deep questions of why. One, why the things that we do work or don't work. Why do they work for one person and not somebody else? What effect are they having on the physiology? But also for me is that I really love teaching and I love empowering my patients with the information to know why they're making choices or doing what they're doing. But I also have this internal sensor that kind of goes off whenever I say something that doesn't feel quite right. And so if I would be sharing something with them from sort of the general assumed theory about why something was working and it didn't feel right, I would have to catch myself and be like, there's something missing in that theory. And maybe it's something we just don't know yet. Maybe it's something I don't know yet. And so I would start delving in, trying to figure out. But there would constantly be this feeling on lots of different fronts. So it'd be like, oh, that's kind of right, but not entirely.
Right. It doesn't feel complete, maybe.
Yeah. And, my passion is really in investigating, like listening to somebody's story and being able to encourage them to keep opening up so that all of these pieces kind of come together into a unified puzzle to understand, like, how is the way you got sick as a child, the temperament that you had when you were young, the patterns that you have, the ways that you go out of balance. Now, how is when somebody comes in and they have what seem like 10 different things going on, and yet knowing that the human body as a whole, how are they actually connected with each other?
Right.
So those were the questions. Endobiogeny,
yeah.
basically.
And I know a little, I mean, I know from what you've taught me a little bit about whenever I was on your rotations for, that we talked about how this kind of brings everything together. So yeah, can you help explain to the listeners how endobiogeny brings it all together?
Yeah, so endobiogenic medicine was started in France. Dr. LaPraz and Dr. Dorafor were the founders of it, and then it's been carried into the US in training by Dr. Hedayat. And I was fortunate enough to be, in sort of the early group of people in that fellowship. But basically, endobiogenic medicine it's a systems medicine. So it is recognizing this beauty and complexity of the human being in all of its nuance, and recognizing that as a system, all the pieces are tied together, and that we are each moving through our world in a very unique expression. So while we have a particular set of genetics, that only gives us kind of our minimum and our maximum parameters. But it doesn't explain all of the fluidity within that defines how you move through the world or how I move through the world, or why a particular illness or trauma or series of events leads to a particular consequence. So endobiogeny is recognizes the system, and also recognizes that systems, that the manager of that system, that what really allows for the body to be in rhythm and dance and move through the world and grow and adapt is the endocrine system, which is all of our hormones. And that the hormones are really what is providing that information and that management to the body and responding to what the needs are, whether they're internal or external.
Right. And I mean, I've talked about hormones before with some of my patients and clients, and I've done presentations on hormones, and every single time, one of the first things that I always say is like, these are just a few of the hormones. If we're talking about just the thyroid hormones, that's all we're talking about. Or if we're just talking about estrogen or progesterone, but they're all so connected and they're so complex. I mean, even after going through 4 years of medical school and then beyond studying on my own, because I really enjoy studying hormones, I feel like I still don't understand. There's just so much complexity to it, far beyond what I just said with the basics of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and thyroid hormone. There's so much more out there.
Yeah. And I would say some of the reason it feels so complex is because we're often learning it without giving it its proper framework. So if we actually recognize that the endocrine system is underlying and managing everything else that happens in the body, then we can view it through a very different lens of, even if there's a digestive issue, what are the strategies that you as an individual, or that I as an individual, are using to manage getting our nutrients? And that's going to involve an endocrine pattern.
Right. I really like that. Yeah, like getting a better understanding of the full system in general.
Yeah.
Yes. So in terms of that, I know one of the biggest things that we had talked about during our rotations was how the adrenals have such a huge impact on the system, which then therefore obviously has an impact on everything else. So could you go into a little bit more on specifically the adrenal glands and how those hormones can affect us?
Yeah. So basically the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys, are, there are two glands there, but we'll kind of glob them as one unit. They are one of the four kind of major glands in the body below the neck that release hormones. And hormones are just chemicals that are released into the bloodstream that can have a far-reaching effect. So basically the main organs that produce and release hormones in the body below the neck are the adrenals, the ovaries or the testes, depending on whether we're female or male, the thyroid, and the pancreas. And the pancreas can both produce hormones and digestive enzymes. So it's got a couple of jobs to do.
Yes.
So in that, the adrenals are really, they are just, as all of those glands are, they are an integral part of the endocrine system and how it does manage physiology. Mm-hmm. When we look at the endocrine system as manager, we begin to see how every one of the hormones, also the ones coming from the hypothalamus and the pituitary within the brain, and then all of those glands out in the body, are all in this kind of intricate dance and rhythm with each other. And the way that they're able to manage physiology is through their feedback mechanisms. So they can send a message to another hormone to do something, they can inhibit something, or they can sort of travel along the path to make something happen.
Right.
So because the hormones can do all of that, mm-hmm. they really are constantly talking to each other in order to make sure the body does what it needs to do. So the adrenals are, if we sort of think schematically, in some ways, they're the first of the endocrine organs to respond to a need to adapt. And even that is a little simplistic, but we'll pretend like that's
right. Yeah. Yeah. Let's definitely simplify it because, like I said, it gets so complex.
Yeah.
And
so I'll just say in many cases, the adrenals are really about, in some ways, setting our rhythm. Cortisol plays a role in how we wake up in the morning, in our diurnal or our day-night physiology, in if we do have an injury or an illness or a trauma of some sort, there is an immediate release of the adrenal hormones to initiate or start the cascade of activity that needs to happen in all of the other hormones to manage that situation.
Right. And that's a protective mechanism. That's what our body is doing to protect us from whatever said harm may be.
It is. But the beautiful thing when we think about, so it's really important when we're thinking about the body in this system or manager, is that the body is always doing what it's doing for a reason.
Right. And
that it has, every single one of these organs or hormones have their just day-to-day activities. Mm-hmm. And the adrenals are, I really think of them now as, they sit on top of the kidneys. They're in our solar plexus area. Their favorite thing to do is to keep us in rhythm with our true nature and with nature itself. They allow for that expression of us as an individual being in rhythm. They have to manage all the other stories or things that come along. So even if there's some like external pressure or some demand or some need to show up that's out of alignment, mm-hmm. the adrenals have to respond to that, but that's not their favorite thing to do.
Yeah. And that's so not their normal day-to-day job. Yeah. That's more of an emergency situation or something like that.
Right. And how each of our bodies responds to those emergency situations and how it manages its day-to-day is part of what sets up the very individualized nature of this medicine and helps us understand why one person gets sick in a certain way and where they need support. So rather than just jumping to the conclusion that like an American lifestyle or a Western lifestyle leaves everybody adrenally depleted, mm-hmm. that's really kind of a false notion. It's more, how does each individual person respond to the stresses of Western lifestyle and where are their particular vulnerabilities within their whole system?
Yes, I like that. I like that a lot because I think, like you said, that's commonly said. A lot of people preach that, just with our Western lifestyles, we're just all adrenally exhausted. And I like that you said that it really depends on how you're coping with it. Right? Each person is going to be different and the way they respond is going to be different. Yeah. All right. So the next question then is like, I know we have different ways of looking at labs. And with conventional labs, most people don't even run hormones in general, especially not cortisol or, doing the salivary cortisol testing or things like that, or DHEA or pregnenolone. All of these things, most people aren't running them in general. But outside of that, endobiogeny does run you do run a few more labs. Am I correct?
Yes. So endobiogeny is a philosophy. It's a theory of how our bodies work and how they show up. And so that paradigm is really what's important. And even if we didn't run labs, from the history, from knowing the signs on physical exam, from putting the pieces together, there's a huge amount of information about one, how a person shows up, where their strengths are, where their vulnerabilities are, and what the patterns of their illness is if they have that.
Okay.
So all of that exists sort of with or without the labs. But what we do also know is that the blood is really carrying the information about how our body's working. Anytime a cell does anything and then is done, it releases something into the bloodstream. Right. And so the blood becomes this channel of information and is therefore very useful in being able to say or witness what the body's doing. So there's in endobiogenic medicine, when we use labs, that's how we look at the values. So it might even be just looking at the relationship of red blood cells to white blood cells to see the relationship of androgen and estrogen activity, because those hormones play a role in the production of those cells. So it's knowing what sort of jobs the hormones have in the body, and then using the blood work as a reflection of how did that job get done. So the analogy is, if we run, let's say we run cortisol or we run serum estrogen levels, we're getting a snapshot of how much hormone is in the blood at that time. Right. Which can be really useful, especially if we're prescribing hormones. There can be a reason to want to know where that level is. And it's also not giving me the information about why that particular person needed or didn't need that much hormone. And it's not really telling me how the hormone actually landed at the cell and got the final job done. And when I'm looking at the body and how it's working, that's a more important question for me. How did you get the job done?
Right.
So I'm looking at really basic lab values like a CBC and a chem screen and TSH. I do run a couple of other enzymes because enzymes are the machinery of the cells. And so I run some enzymes that come from muscle tissue, and I run some enzymes that are involved in bone metabolism to get that broader picture of how the body's working.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I that's exactly right. I tell my patients and clients that all the time. Like, even your labs, it's just a snapshot in time. And I like the way you put it. It's just because we're not seeing the end result then. Right. We don't really know how it's affecting your tissues, but it's in your blood. That's all we know. And it definitely, of course, like you said, can be very helpful in determining certain things, but at the same time, that's not the full picture. It's not the full picture. So so you talked about some signs without even doing some lab testing, indicating potentially what's going on in the body. Could you give us an example of that?
Yeah. I mean, it's always important to know, again, because we're looking at a bigger system. Right. There's no one sign that we can take like categorically or by itself. So whenever I'm doing both history, physical exam, and labs, I'm always bringing as many of the pieces together as I can to get a more complete picture, because it would be really inaccurate to say like, there's this one sign and then that determines what's happening. Right. But just a really simple one, even when you're looking at somebody's face, the length and the curl of their eyelashes is witnessing the activity of a couple of the pituitary hormones, specifically follicle stimulating hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone.
Interesting. Wow.
And these can change because these are all very active and changing hormones. So some women will notice that their eyelashes are longer or more curled at different parts of their cycle.
Interesting. I'm going to have to check that now.
Sometimes we can see in children, children tend to, like little boys tend to have super long and curled eyelashes. this is witnessing that FSH activity for the estrogen that's needed to build their bodies, because estrogen is our main builder of proteins.
Wow, that is really interesting. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, now I'm going to be checking my eyelashes every day to see where they're at and see where my FSH, LH levels are at.
Yeah, and again, we can't make, it's FSH and TSH, but again, we couldn't make it categorical. You know, we would need to put it into context with other things, because there are genetic differences in eyelash length, and there are other disorders that would cause them to change, or, you know, so it takes that whole framework. But
yeah, and what other things that are going on. I remember learning at one point, you know, sometimes looking at hands or right under the eyes, you can notice different things. And so like combining all of these things, it's not just looking at the eyelashes,
right.
and then understanding
taking note of as many pieces of data as you can, which like, you know, as much as this medicine can like play between science and esoteric, for me, that's the fun of it, is like I am absolutely always gathering data points. Yeah. And those data points also help feed this intuitive sense of what's happening for people.
Definitely. All right. So do you have any resources or anything that you'd like to share with the audience on endobiogenic medicine?
Yeah. So the Society for Endobiogenic Medicine in the US is ASAMIP, and the American Society of Endobiogenic Medicine. And their website is, I believe it's endobiogeny.com. Okay. And also, I'm super happy that the first textbooks of endobiogenic medicine actually just got published.
Wow, that's exciting.
I will show this one here. So it's called The Theory of Endobiogeny. The authors are Dr. Kamyar, Hedayat, and Claude LaPraz. And these are available through Elsevier Press. So the first 2 of 4 are available, and certainly for, I mean, I would not, anybody could read them, but they're going to be more useful certainly for a, you know, a physician trained person. So
yeah, definitely. And we will have all of that in the show notes. So just in case you didn't catch that.
Like for our, you know, for our patients, for our audience, for all of those kinds of things, it's more difficult. There's not as much written or out there yet. So
yeah. And that's when they can see practitioners like yourself who have trained in it and understand it even better. And a lot of times, I mean, I remember a lot of your patients were the ones who really no one could find answers to. You know, they really struggled with finding what was going on. Even if they had seen holistic practitioners or naturopathic doctors or functional medicine doctors, they still may not have found what exactly is going on and why they're dealing with what they're dealing with. And a lot of times that's what your patient base ended up being, I feel.
Yeah, it is a lot of the time. And it's not that we always find the answer either, because I don't think that's how life works. But my goal is to investigate and learn enough that people can get a place where they feel more empowered and have more agency over their health and how they move through the world.
Exactly. Love it. Okay, before we move on to the rapid fire questions, do you have anything else that you'd like to add about endobiogenic medicine that I may not have touched on yet?
Not that I can think of right now.
Okay, great. All right, so we're going to move on to the rapid fire questions. These are questions that I ask all of my guests, and so that's why I like to keep it consistent. I always find it fascinating to learn how different people answer different questions. So the first question is, what does Mahan Health mean to you?
It is, Mahan Health for me is that sense of understanding yourself, understanding and remembering ourselves as divine essence, as life force that moves through. And I think the more in tune we are and the more we understand how life force moves through our individual bodies, the more we can make choices that empower that. So we can make a choice to eat in a particular way or move in a particular way or be mindful or take a medicine or anything else from a place of, oh, this is where I've got my strengths. This is where I've got my weaknesses. this is how life moves through me, and how can I best support that?
Yes, I love it. Okay, the next question is, actually the next two questions kind of go hand in hand or not, but for some people it's the same thing. So what was the most difficult health change for you to make personally, and what are you still working on?
Yeah, I think it goes hand in hand. It's really, I think for me, one of the biggest things is my own self-talk. We have our own stories that get developed over time, and our own strategies that we learn to employ to get through life. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of reasons for those developing, and they're not good or bad necessarily, but at some point they become less skillful or less useful. And so that, while I've done, for me, I've had to completely eliminate gluten, and that's fine, and it makes me feel better. And so it really, it was difficult, but it wasn't, it was doable. But this process of really untangling the stories and the patterns and the ways that I communicate with myself, and that I mistrust myself, or that those vulnerable places, those are harder.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And the reason why I actually asked that question is because a lot of times us healthcare practitioners, especially in our world of naturopathic medicine, we talk about all these things on living a healthier lifestyle, but we've struggled as well. And sometimes people look at us and they're like, oh, well, you're somehow perfect. And so I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with. Yeah. And this, I feel like these questions help humanize us a little bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. And then the last question is kind of fun. If you were to have a commercial about health, it was more of a PSA. You're not necessarily selling anything. You just get the word out to billions of people all throughout the world. What would it be about, and why?
Oh, that's a hard one. This is going to sound really broad, and I would have to give it much more thought to put it into detail. But I think, for me, again, it's that sense of empowering people. And one of my big struggles is that so many of our messages are messages of fear and messages of disempowerment. And so if there was a commercial that could constantly reinforce the idea that people are amazing, that human beings are these, that life is amazing, and that we can remember who we are, and we can be in tune with that, and we really can operate from that loving force, that I think, I would love for that to be this profound shift on society.
Yes, I completely agree. We need more positivity out there, and talking about, the triumphs of humankind and the resilience. I love it. All right. Well, so this is it. Where can people find you if they were looking for you and looking to work with you?
Yeah. So my Instagram handle is Amy Chadwick, ND. My current website is soaringcraneclinic.com. That may be changing more to my name here soon, but it'll transfer over. You can find it. Okay. And you can reach me by phone as well. You can find that both on the Instagram and the website. So those are the easiest pieces.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciated having you, and I always learn so much from you, and today is absolutely no different.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed that episode and found endobiogeny to be as fascinating as I thought it was. I will have Dr. Chadwick's information and the resources she mentioned in the show notes below, so make sure to check those out. But that's really all I got for you all today. Wishing you all Mahan or great health, and I will see you next time.